Okay. So next I'd like for us to discuss kinship charts. For the purposes of our course, you will only have to understand the simplest of kinship charts, and I have provided an example of one here. Now, again, historically, anthropologists use kinship charts to show descent relationships. In other words, who descended from whom. Again, essentially a family tree. Um, and kinship, again, was traditionally understood in terms of consanguineal kin, kin by blood, and affinal kin, or kin by marriage. So if we look at this particular kinship chart, you will see that the equal sign represents marriage or potentially sexual union, right? Certainly not all societies use, say, a Christian or Muslim form of union, marriage. Um, but they might have their own traditions. You'll have every kinship chart has ego at its center, so the anthropologist chooses someone who they're studying very closely to represent ego, and then whoever that person is, they chart out. So, for example, and triangles are represent men, whereas circles represent women. Kinship charts, in this sense, are old-fashioned and represent a sex gender binary, which of course we know isn't true. They're individuals whose gender expression defies the sex that they were assigned at birth. But this is what we have inherited, folks. Um, so who is this triangle up top at the top of the chart? The triangle connected to the marriage sign. Who is that triangle in relationship to ego? Well, that's ego's father there, right? Ego's father married ego's mother, and then you go down to see their children. How many children did ego's mom and dad have together? They had 3. 2 boys, 1 girl. Okay. So going down means you're going down in terms of descent, the children that they gave birth to. If you go up, you can obviously see who their parents were. For example, let's take another example to test your knowledge. This triangle to the right of the word male, so the triangle to the right of the father. Who is that to ego? You might have said ego's uncle, and that would be true. But actually, the anthropologist would say that's ego's father's brother. Because again, uncle is a term we use in our culture, but not all cultures will use that. So we try to be more kind of specific. That's ego's uncle, father's brother. Okay. What about the circle to the left of mom? That's ego's mother's sister. Or aunt, right? Or excuse me, his aunt. Okay. You'll see here in this kinship chart, you start to see mother, sister, mother's brother. I don't expect you to memorize those, the use of those words, FASI, FABR, but that shows how, again, they're not using aunt or uncle because those are culturally specific terms. Okay. I do expect you to understand parallel cousins and cross cousins, however. Parallel cousins, so we have ego here, ego's father and mother, ego's mother's sister, his aunt, right, had 2 kids. So if your aunt has children, those children to you are your cousin, right? These are parallel cousins because mom and mom's sister are both women. So female and female means that those are considered parallel cousins. However, if we cross gender, like look at mom's brother's kids, those will be cross cousins. Let me reinforce this. So if we look at father's side, the ego's dad's brother's kids, well, those are going to be parallel cousins because dad, brother, male, male. But dad's sister's children are going to be cross cousins to ego. That matters because in some societies, your parallel cousin might be your ideal marriage partner, and vice versa. It might be that your cross cousin is the ideal marriage partner. And yes, I said cousin, ideal marriage partner. In many societies, certain kinds of cousins, maybe second cousins, etc., will actually be the ideal marriage partner. And that was true even within our own society, several, say 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Okay. So again, the circle means alliance. That's the formal term meaning essentially marriage or some sort of union. And descent, reproduction. Who did they give birth to? Okay. So we're going to look now at some marriage patterns that exist outside of monogamous partners or monogamous marriage, which of course is the norm in our society. So I have a few more terms for you. The first is polygamy. Polygamy is a pattern in which a person has more than one spouse. So many of you might have thought of, say, the show Sister Wives. Oh, that's polygamy. Well, actually, more specifically, that is polygyny. Polygyny is when a man has more than one wife. Okay. And then we also have polyandry, which is less common. This is a pattern in which a woman is married to more than one man at a given time. Again, this is far less common than polygyny, and we tend to find it in, for example, Tibet, Nepal, and India. Note that polygyny and polyandry are heteronormative. We're sort of working within the assumption of heteronormativity. So I do want to point that out, and that's an important critique to make. Even in societies which practice or approve polygamy, however, it's not practiced by the majority of the population. Okay, so let's start with polygyny. Polygyny, again, is a situation in which a man may marry more than one woman. You may be familiar with this. Say, let's take, there's a number of reality shows that have covered this topic. Polygyny we also find in various parts of the world, in various Islamic societies, in West Africa, for example. Now, what's important to note is that all of these marriage patterns, customs, and are systems that have their own norms and rules and regulations, just like any other. Right? So if we look at polygyny, you might know already that not every man in a polygynous society actually is in a polygynous relationship. Why do you think that is? Well, in order for a man to enter a polygynous relationship, typically they have to be able to support all of these women equally and well, right? So in other words, you tend to have to be a man who is well off, a chief, for example, right? Or someone who has made a lot of money in order to be able to do this. Again, this tends to be only taken up by men with ample resources who can take on a second wife. These multiple wives allow women in polygynous relationships to kind of pool their resources and time. Imagine, for example, that you are a woman in a polygynous relationship in a rural village in West Africa where there's no running water, right? Scholars have, including feminist African scholars, have written about polygyny. And while in the West, we often see this as sexist, right? Why is it that one man gets to be with multiple women, right? Women in polygynous relationships, some women anyway, have described the benefits to being in a polygynous relationship, right? You can pool your resources again in terms of domestic labor for example, instead of watching children, right? One woman can do that while another woman goes to the market, for example, instead of one woman trying to do it all, right? So again, it's important to, in a society where there are no washing machines, right? Like it's important to be able to think very strategically about labor and how you pool resources in order to get that domestic work done. Now, polyandry tends to exist in societies where there's a lopsided sex ratio, where there's more men than women, or sometimes in societies where men have to leave that society for a long period of time, for example, in the case of warfare or long-distance trade. I'm going to have you watch a clip that, again, I will post in the comment section that describes an example of fraternal polyandry in Tibet. Okay. Now, by fraternal polyandry, I'm referring to two or more than two brothers marrying the same woman, so they share the same wife. This is especially effective for brothers who have limited resources. In the case you'll be looking at, there's a limited resources is related to land. Look at their environment and watch how they pool their resources together by taking just one wife. Okay, this also restricts the number of future heirs and therefore restricts how much they would have to therefore segment their land away to potential future inheritors, right? Future sons, for example. And the land argument's really key when we look at, as you'll see in this clip, when it comes to polyandry in the Himalayas, because there's very little arable land. Arable meaning farmable, right? Like can actually grow crops. So in a place where there's very little land to go around, by fraternal polyandry limits the amount of children that come into the world, right? Because a woman can only reproduce so often, even if she has two husbands. So it's a kind of evolutionary form of birth control, right? Okay, so I'm going to have you pause this lecture now and watch the clip on polyandry in Tibet. Now you'll notice from that clip that it also talks about, other models for love and marriage that have entered the village through films or Bollywood films or whatever. This idea of what we call companionate marriage or romantic marriage, the idea that the ideal marriage partner is someone you deep down love or attracted to, this is not a cross-cultural universal. This comes to us from a medieval European tradition of courtly love, right? And it's, again, one that we tend to think of as normal, as natural, maybe even best, right? Not all cultures think that. In fact, there's a lot of, it's hard to find that person that you truly quote unquote love in many societies, right? So some folks have started to kind of go back to some of these other traditions of say arranged marriage. Okay, so let's go over a few more concepts. Endogamy means when you marry within your own community or group, broadly defined. This could mean, for example, marrying within your own, again, clan. Let's say you have a particular clan, or say cross-cousin marriage, right? Marrying someone who's broadly conceived already within your group. We also have religious endogamy. This would mean, for example, in various Hindu castes, for example, Brahmins in India, right, the elite kind of Hindu caste, when they only want to marry other Brahmins, that's a kind of religious endogamy. Now, in our society, we tend to be exogamous. The idea here is that you want to marry someone completely outside, completely unrelated to you in terms of your own community or group, right? And then we have three different models for residency. We have patrilocal residence. This is when, a married couple, after they get married, they move in with the husband's family. Next, we have matrilocal residence. This is when a married couple moves in with the wife's family. And lastly, neolocal residence. This is the norm, of course, here in North America. This is where the married couple goes off and sets up their own house and residence. This is an image of goods, presents, that are about to be presented to the groom's family, given to them by the bride's family upon marriage. Do you know what this is called? This is called dowry. Again, this is when goods are transferred from the family of the bride to the family of the groom. Dowry we tend to find this in societies where women have lower status, or have very little status, in fact. It's less common than bride wealth, which I'll explain momentarily. Dowry correlates with the idea that the wife is a burden to the husband's family, and so again, the wife's family is giving a gift to the husband's family, saying, thank you for taking on, right, this extra mouth to feed sort of idea. It exists in only about 4% of cultures worldwide, mostly in South Asia, or North Africa and the Balkans. It's usually found in patrilineal, patrilocal societies. Again, this is connected to the idea that the wife is somehow a burden to the groom's family. Now, the opposite of this is bride wealth. This is when goods are going to be given to the bride's family. The groom gives a gift, some sort of gift to the bride's family. This makes many Westerners feel uncomfortable, right? We tend to hear the critique that, oh my goodness, it's as if you're buying your wife, right? And sure, we are exchanging, in a sense, some sort of goods in a ritual way for the handed marriage of this wife. But another way of thinking about it is that they're trying to compensate the bride's wife for the loss that they will incur when she leaves their home, in terms of the labor that she might have been providing in the household, the extra help that she had long provided. Again, this is sort of reducing women to domestic labor, but the idea is they recognize her value, right, within the family, and they want to kind of give something to show that they understand that it is a loss on the part of that family. Okay. You've been reading the book Lisa, the ethnographic graphic novel for this course. I'd like you to take a moment and reflect on where you saw the idea of kinship, family, relatedness appear in the book. Think about embodied forms of kinship, as in genes or genetic traits. Thinking about Anna's mother and Anna, right? Think about responsibilities that we have to our kin in terms of care work. And think about forms of relationality that go beyond blood and marriage, right? Some of the ties that the interlocutors in this book found, again, beyond blood or marriage. Please go ahead and record your reflections in your notes. Okay. Changing old paradigms, moving on towards new kinship studies. So new kinship studies was a change in a kind of a new school of thought in anthropology that, of course, at this point is already quite old, but it was still a radical and important shift in the way that anthropologists thought about kinship. I've already mentioned David Schneider. He's an American anthropologist who was writing in the 60s and the 80s. And he questioned this obsession with the idea of describing certain kin as like my real kin, right? Kin by blood versus kin by marriage. Right? Basically, he said not all societies do that, right? That might be kind of particular to our own society. And even within our own society, we have subcultures or groups who are not as obsessed with this idea of real kin, right? Or they have different ways of creating relations with other people. So it really challenged the assumption that kinship is all about finding and establishing biological forms of relatedness. This was important at this time period because, again, in the latter half of the 20th century, in the late 60s through the 70s and 80s and early 90s, you had a bunch of new things going on in terms of families and structure in North America. You had transnational forms of adoption. Right? People were adopting children from Latin America, from East Asia. You had LGBT forms of kinship and families. You had children who were being brought in the world through assisted reproductive technologies. You had women who were acting as surrogates, right, who gave birth to children, but then gave them to some other parents, right? All of this really challenged what we thought of as a society was a natural or real family. Right? It really challenged those ideas and showed how they were culturally specific in a particular way, right? So we started to move away from talking about kinship to thinking about, still kinship, but also more importantly, relatedness. right? Not just kin by blood or marriage, but how do we relate to other human beings more broadly speaking? An example of this is, when I learned Intro to Cultural Anthropology, I was taught that adopted children are referred to as fictive kin, right? That they're fictive kin. But we no longer think that in cultural anthropology. Just because you're adopted doesn't make that relationship any less real, right? Other forms of relationality that go beyond blood or marriage, I've mentioned godparent, an adopted child, also milkkin, that example I gave earlier, right? Again, yes, it's problematic to refer to any of these as fictive kin because these are real relationships in the eyes of the people who hold them. These pictures here reflect women who are part of a milk share group where they share breast milk with one another. Again, that's an idea that would be very disturbing for individuals who come from a society where there's this concept of milkkin, because then you'd have no clue who you're potentially related to if so many women are sharing milk with so many different babies, right? Again, just another example of how different these ideas about kinship can end up being. There is nothing fake about these relationships. They are just as real as consanguineal relations. Right? Okay. So I'm going to have you listen to a story, to watch a story. It's on YouTube. And I have a question for you. How do the relationships described in this news story challenge older anthropological ideas about kinship? Specifically, I'd like you to think about the chart, the kinship chart, right, that showed two people who are joined by marriage and who have children. How does this story challenge that? Or maybe it doesn't, right? What does it tell us about, and how does it fit or not fit into the anthropological model for a family tree or kinship charts? Okay. Please go ahead and submit your response on Scholar. Thank you.